Good evening, everyone. It is your girl, Marcy Thomas of the BGC Book Club and Brown Girl Collective. And I'm so excited for you to join us this evening for a wonderful conversation with a young lady that I had the opportunity to meet a few moments ago, but actually met her through the process of reading her book. So come on in the room. Just to tell you a little bit about me. I am once again the founder of Brown Girl Collective, which has been around for about 13 years now. BGC Book Club is 2.5. So it's a wonderful space that I've been blessed to be able to talk to a lot of wonderful Black women writers who are telling stories by, for, and about us. And every now and again, we get a chance to actually hear not a book that's fiction, but actually hear something that is nonfiction, someone having an opportunity to tell their own story. And tonight's story or night's author, that's exactly what we'll be doing. Who we have with us this evening is Mary Alice Daniel, who was born near the border between Niger and Nigeria. Her tribe is Hausa Fulani. She grew up in England and Tennessee. And after attending Yale University, she earned an MFA from the University of Michigan and a PhD in English literature and creative writing from the University of Southern California. Her first book of prose, which we'll be talking about this evening, is A Coastline is an Immeasurable Thing, a memoir across 3 continents. She also has a book coming out next year, which is her debut poetry collection, which won the 2022 Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize and will be published in March of 2023. So hopefully we can get her back to share her poetry as well. So without any further delay, let's bring into the room Mary Alice Daniel. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm super excited to have you in the room. As we've been going back and forth, preparing for this, and I read the book, I was super excited just to talk more about your story because it just answered some questions for me about Africa, Nigeria specifically, but then it was also good just to hear your story.
Okay, thank you for that.
So tell us a little bit about what led you to write A Coastline is an Immeasurable Thing. What was the inspiration?
Well, so actually, I wrote this memoir kind of accidentally. I definitely never expected or intended to write a memoir. I'm pretty young. I'm 35, and oh wait, no, I'm 36. And I actually didn't think I had the life experience to write a memoir. And there's so much about my country that I still don't know and don't understand, especially as someone who hasn't gone back for a decade. There's also, a very cultural and familial taboo against revealing and divulging a lot of personal family stories, intimate details. So I was really struggling with like things I could say and things I could not say. I know a lot of Americans will write memoirs that are kind of like tell-alls, and they'll just like put it all out there. And that was never an option for me if I wanted to maintain family ties and just kind of not cause a lot of division in my family. So I was always hyper aware of the fact that we don't really talk about a lot of the things that I do talk about in this book. So memoir was never really on the table for me. The book started as part of my dissertation when I was at USC doing my PhD. So it was about the history of the name of the state of California. So it comes from the word caliph, which refers to a religious ruler or a caliphate. And it was named after the empress of the island of California, who happened to be a Black woman. And there was a myth about her. And when I read this story, I realized that, not a lot of people know about it. There hadn't been a lot written about it. So I said, okay, I want to write a dissertation kind of exploring this Black history, this hidden Black history of California. I showed like an excerpt or chapter of the dissertation to Dan Halpern at Echo HarperCollins, just thinking I would just get some feedback or something about how I could at once write a dissertation and something more marketable, because a lot of people struggle with publishing their dissertations and finding an audience of, people who want to read something academic.
Right.
Then he was really, really interested, and he was like, I think that you're ready to make it a standalone book right now. So I wrote the first several chapters, and my editors were the ones who, when I made the connection between the caliphate in California and the fact that I come from a place called the Sokoto Caliphate, which was also an Islamic religious kingdom, they were like, well, this link should be explored more than you have explored it. And then I explained that a little bit. And then they were like, well, hold on, but what tribe is that? So I explained that a little bit. And I was like, and then they were like, but so your mom and your dad are different tribes. So I explained that. So from this one original like academic story that was kind of like impersonal, I just followed all these different threads like back and back and back until it became not just about my immediate family's immigration story, but then my ancestors and their myths. And it just kind of like spread from there and became a memoir because my editors were really encouraging me to explain and explore some of the personal feelings and details that they felt was needed in this book, that was needed context. And I was very shy and I needed a lot of prodding, but I'm really glad that they pushed me because it took a lot of I guess, an internal struggle and conflict to resolve. That's why it took me so long to write the book. But in the end, now that it's out there in the world, I definitely have mixed feelings about some of the stories that I did share. But I am proud that I was able to get past the kind of like the shame of, talking about some of these things that I talk about.
Well, thank you for sharing. I mean, that brought up several things for me. First and foremost, just the fact I appreciate your bravery in being able to step outside of the norm, culturally and tell those stories. And quite honestly, even though, you are originally from Nigeria, even here, you've been living in the United States. Yeah. Black Americans, it's the same thing. Yeah. It's like we're not supposed to tell certain stories. We're not supposed to talk about certain things. Mm-hmm. But there is power in being able to tell those stories, not only for your own, healing and, the things that you need to do personally, but and the fact that it helps others. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that and share this story. The second thing, it's personal, but it's not, how can I put it? I learned a lot in reading it. Mm-hmm. About the history of Nigeria and other things. So yes, it was personal. It's your story, but it wasn't so personal that I feel like I'm in all your business. It's not that personal, right?
And I had originally written a couple more chapters that were more personal about the year I lived in New York and my relationship. And then a little bit more about college. And I ended up cutting those because I felt like I didn't really fit the tone. Mm-hmm. And in terms of how much historical context I included, that was also something that I wasn't sure about. Some people said there's like too much history, but I wanted anybody to be able to pick it up, as someone who doesn't know anything about Nigeria, and just have that, kind of background context.
No, thank you. We have a comment from Laura who says, beautiful that you were so considerate of your family ties. Delicate balance, no doubt. And how marvelous you landed with such interested and encouraging editors. I would agree wholeheartedly. Well, one of the things she talked about, learning about Nigeria, ironically, just last week, I had a conversation with a good friend of mine about traveling. A lot of Black Americans have been deciding to go over to Africa, to the motherland, to different places within the motherland. And I was saying how, there's 54 different countries on the continent, but there's some places that you hear people going a lot, and then there are other places that you really don't hear people going to. And I mentioned Nigeria. So, of course, in reading your story, I find out some of why we might not see a lot of people going in and out of Nigeria. So for those who may not know a lot of the history of the country, just give us a little bit of background on what Nigeria is all about.
Well, I should first of all say that I definitely don't want to discourage anyone from going to Nigeria, because the country is completely different in different regions. So the part that I'm from, the northern part, is a place that's extremely dangerous to travel. And, you know, that's like a do not recommend. But there are other parts of the country, Abuja, the central capital, and like Lagos is a very popular tourist destination. So if somebody wanted to go to Lagos, it's a completely different story. Like they're like two different countries. And so in this memoir, I really tried to make it clear that I am making and emphasizing the distinction between my region, because for so many different reasons, we have a lot of problems that the rest of the country doesn't really deal with. So yeah, if someone is interested in going to Nigeria, West Africa, I know Ghana is really popular. I was there for a while and I loved it. You know, and I was just like, if I were Ghanaian instead of Nigerian, I would be living here, because they just don't have the kind of like religious and political strife that we have. So definitely don't avoid West Africa. Don't avoid Nigeria, except for the parts that are like actively, I would say, war zones. And I think it's very, very important to note that there are a lot of negative stereotypes about Africa, of course. And when I first started writing this book, one of my Black American friends, she said, I'm just not interested in hearing like any more negative narratives about Africa. And I like, completely agreed with her. Like the way that Africa is portrayed is so one-sided and unfair. And then in this book, I then proceed to talk about like violence, poverty, you know, like oppression of women, over religiosity and all those things. So I do go on to talk about Nigeria in a somewhat negative way, but I also think it's balanced. Yes. And I think it's my truth. Like I didn't want to add to negative stereotypes, but I had to be honest. And I also always emphasize that this is this one particular region, and nobody can take this and say, oh, see, Africa is like that. So in terms of the history of Nigeria, it is our history that makes it so volatile, because the country of Nigeria does not make sense as a country. It's not separated by like natural boundaries. It's not separated by ethnic groups or groups of people. It wasn't like one past kingdom. It was hundreds of different tribes, several different kingdoms. And the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Germans, they kind of just divided Africa based on what resources they wanted. They negotiated with themselves, like, okay, you take this, we'll take this. And they just drew like our borders on a map like that. Okay, so this is going to be Nigeria. And the British said, okay, we'll take that. The French took Niger right above us. And so one of my tribes, Fulani, it's like completely divided by the border line. So my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, actually spoke French. And when we wanted to visit their side, we'd have to cross the border. So the fact that it's all of these people who had nothing in common before, because they were in different tribes and kingdoms, all of a sudden have to learn to live under colonialism and then in this brand new country that was completely arbitrarily created, has caused so many issues. And it seems like there's really no end in sight. Even the corruption that we have, that's just endemic and endless, also kind of goes back to colonialism, the way they managed us. They like appointed certain tribes over other tribes to like be middle managers. And so that created a lot of tension. And the tribes like competed for political power. They didn't know how to get along yet because they hadn't had to learn. And under colonialism, there was a lot of corruption because people were trying to like protest and like slow down their export and the theft of resources by making things not work, not efficient. And then after the British left, it just kind of never really recovered. They also dismantled a lot of the systems that we had in place. For example, in my region, we had a really strong history of literature and scholarship and poetry. And then that empire was disbanded by the British, and that was lost. So there are a lot of things that were lost and not regained. And it's a very young nation, and we just have not found a way forward from my perspective, it seems. So that's the background, I think. Oh, and I also should mention, this is very important. So if you think of the country as like two sides,
right,
two halves, the north is mostly Muslim, and the south is mostly Christian. And then, of course, there are like indigenous spiritualities, but that's the general gist. And then the capital is right in the center. So it's literally like divided about 50-50. And two sides don't, see eye to eye on a lot of things because of religious differences.
I found that very powerful as well, because one of the things, of course, you do talk about your family history and the fact that people were from different tribes. And even within that, I think you say there's 4.5 different parts of your family with a stepmother thrown in. So, as I thought about that, that's true for all of us, because I know that there are like 3 parts of my family I'm really familiar with. And there's a 4th that I'm not as familiar with. And just thinking about how fortunate you are that you are able to go back and, dig around and get information to find out about these different people. But also the fact that you do have within your own family unit, you do have, Muslims, you have Christians, you have people who may have followed the more traditional religions. All of that is there, and all of that makes up who you are as a person ultimately.
Yeah. And some may see that as a positive, and I definitely see the positive in that, because there's so many rich aspects of our culture that I can look to, not only for writing, but just for just a sense of connection to a culture. But it also creates a lot of conflict. And it's like there are different factions in my family that are kind of at war. And they can't reconcile. So it causes a lot of tension. There's a lot of drama, especially since some of the family structures would have multiple wives. So a man, like 4 wives, and you can kind of imagine like, so the sense of drama in the normal family, and then like my family, my extended family, I feel has always been like really heightened in my life. So it's sometimes been hard to see the positives of having people of like different religions and different worldviews in the same family. And sometimes I've wished, that there weren't like so many divisions in my family. So it's definitely a kind of pros and cons in coming from a background like mine.
So let's talk a little bit about the thing that led you to be in 3 different continents, because we've been focusing a lot on Africa, of course, and Nigeria specifically. But there came a point in time when your family moved to England. So that was like your first opportunity to be your tribes were, some of your tribes were nomadic, or moved around a lot anyway, but just for you as a family, as a collective family unit, that was the first time that you had opportunity to move. And how old you were, about 7 or 8 when that happened, or a little younger?
To England?
To England, yes.
Oh, no, I was a toddler.
You were a toddler. Okay. So so then you really didn't have a whole lot from Africa or Nigeria at that point anyway.
No, I don't remember my birthplace at all, the city I was born in.
So what was it like once you got old enough to really realize that you were in a place that was different from your homeland? What was that transition like for you in England?
It was hard because my first language, my native language, Hausa. Um, when I was around like 3, 4 in England, I only knew Hausa because my mom kept me at home because I couldn't handle the nursery environment. I freaked out. So she kept me at home. I didn't know English. I was so young that I picked it up very quickly. And by, I would say, 6, I was fluent in English. Um, but it was a tough transition in those early years that I barely remember. Like, it's so hard for me to think back to a time that I didn't know English because
Mhm.
I think in English, I write in English, I dream in English. My Hausa is like worse and worse every year. But there was a time I remember in England that I was just constantly in tears because I didn't understand certain things,
Mhm.
and I feel like there was no proper translation for what I was trying to say, so there was just a lot of like frustration. And then after I was enrolled in school, knew the language. Um, I don't know how to describe England. It's not a place I would say I look upon fondly,
Mhm.
just in terms of my experiences there, but it's also a place that I'm very grateful that I was able to live in, because I got to go to school and
Mhm.
I had a lot of opportunities there. Like my cousins who didn't leave
Right.
Nigeria were not enrolled in like good schools. Um, it was very cold, very depressing.
Mhm.
The house we lived in was, I mean, when I was a kid, kids sometimes don't really notice a lot of aspects about their environment because a child can like play with anything, or
Right.
so to us, we found ways to play. Looking back on it, um, it was a kind of a really bleak situation financially. My father's university, who'd been sponsoring him, stopped paying, so we were really, really broke. So just living in this poverty um, did cause some stresses because we never had like clothes. We always were like the poor African kids, like just in terms of like our outward appearance. And then I was the only Black child in my class.
Mhm.
So I did stick out. I have really fond memories of England too because I got to explore a lot of the country with my godparents. My school did a lot of like cultural events. Like your school there is a really big part of the community. Everybody lives within walking distance. So we walked to school, we walked back. It was way more social than America, I found in that sense.
Hmm.
Because people just walk and you run into
Right.
your neighbors. On the way home from school, you'll stop at your neighbors and then you walk to church. And then it was like a smaller, like little city. There's definitely more of a sense of like social cohesion in England. In America, you have the sense of like different groups of people just like really hate each other. In England, where I lived, there was some racial tension, but it was nothing like uh, American racism, which I
Mm.
believe is a completely different um, sort of beast. So even just being made to feel like an outsider or awkward or lonely or frustrated, um, and it was so cold, and I hate the cold. I never felt at home, and I was never quite like um, at ease there. And
Mhm.
I'm pretty glad we left. I'm very glad that we left England. Um, but my connection to it is, I consider it the place I grew up, but I don't feel much of a really strong connection to England so
Mhm.
many years later.
And that makes sense. One of the things that you talk about, not just being there and the feelings of being in England and being like the only black, child in your class and things like that. But then also opportunities when you had to go back home, to your homeland,
Hmm.
feeling kind of out of place there as well, because as you mentioned, you weren't, your cousins and other relatives weren't having some of the same experiences. And then they start to look at you differently when you come back home.
Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, my older brother, older sister, and I, like, we stuck out. Um, in some good ways and some bad ways. Like, they loved us. They loved our visits because we always brought them presents. We brought them like toys and candy and stuff. So everyone was so excited when we would visit, and like people would come from like the whole village or town to come see us. It was like a huge event. But they also teased us a lot because we picked up some habits that just we found really funny, and we had forgotten like how to do certain things. And then the language, like any other language, there's a lot of slang, there's music, and we didn't know any of that. So we were kind of outsiders in that sense. Um, and also in terms of just the work that my cousins had to do, it was such a huge difference. In England, I went to school, I did a few chores. My older sister did most of them. I helped sometimes. I'm the baby, so I really honestly didn't do a whole lot. In Nigeria, my cousins are up at dawn, to get water from the well. My grandfather ran a farm, like a small farm, with like goats, chickens, turkeys, and they were helping to take care of the animals. And they went to school, and they helped raise their siblings, and it's just like completely different. So I don't think they resented me at all. But I think that they definitely saw as kind of spoiled and like out of touch. And I think that a lot of people, when you leave and you come to a place like America, they assume that you're like rich and you have like easy. So we just completely didn't really have the language to be able to talk to each other. Like, I didn't want to say, no, we're actually really broke in England too, because you would have seen that as, kind of like first world problems, which in a sense it is, but we did definitely struggle a lot. And then just the cultural divide, because Nigeria is such a religious place. And my home life was very religious. But then when I went out in the world or when I was watching TV, like my cousins didn't have an MTV.
Right.
They didn't have the internet. So we kind of just like grew in completely opposite directions, where I could have like a crush on a boy, and that was something that they would not be like, they'd be shocked. They wouldn't be able to talk about it. The idea of them having a crush on a boy, because it's not like they would be able to date, or there was no casual dating. There was nothing like that. There was no having boyfriends. So just like things that you take for granted, just being like a normal like kid or adolescent, for them it wasn't a thing. And again, this is just like my family, my region.
Right.
Sure, in other parts of Nigeria, that there were like liberal parents and people do date and things like that. Just not in my family, not at all.
Right. That makes me think, and you mentioned it in your book, Nollywood, because I will admit I have watched a lot of Nollywood films and things like that on Netflix. And so as I'm watching, I'm like, oh, well, their life looks a lot like mine. But that's not necessarily true.
Yeah. So, but that's usually like filmed in like the southern parts, like bigger cities. And the lifestyle there is very different. Like, they'll have the internet, they'll have a satellite TV. But my family was from a very rural area. We didn't have electricity most of the time. Definitely no internet. Even getting books was difficult. So what you see in Nollywood films is definitely not representative of like rural areas, like villages and farms and things like that. It's definitely like a slower, more traditional, strict upbringing.
And even the fact that Nollywood doesn't show the spaces that may be impoverished even within the larger cities. It doesn't.
Yeah.
You don't see any of that.
Yeah, Nollywood is something that's it is fun. It's fun to watch, and like the special effects and everything are hilarious. But it's actually one thing that also makes me feel a little bit of a disconnect. Because my experience in Nigeria is like nothing like that. You know, you see that they live in like really nice mansions, drive nice cars, have the latest fashions and things like that. And that's just not the reality for my family and where they're living. And their conditions are just completely different. So,
different, right?
yeah.
And that makes me think, even here in in the U.S., we have different experiences because there are people who live in rural areas. There are people who may live in areas that may not have as many resources. So in that regard, it's really the same, but a lot of times what you see isn't truly a true representation of
Right.
what's going on with the vast majority of people. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, you wound up in the U.S. a little later and started off in the South.
Yeah. That was a really kind of crazy transition going from England to Nashville. And actually, looking back on it, I loved Nashville. I really, really like living in Nashville just because. So, my brother and I have an older brother who's 2 years older, and I would hang out with him, and we made a lot of friends with like neighborhood kids, and we just kind of went wild, you know. Um, in England, I guess we were at the age where we would walk to school and walk back. We'd have like play dates, but we weren't like out in the streets.
Right.
You know? In Tennessee, my parents were working. We lived in this apartment complex. It was right by the river. And it was summer. So we literally just spent all day like just hanging out with kids, getting into trouble. The kids get into doing like looking back on extremely dangerous things in the river and all over. We were just like hooligans, and that was so much fun. It was like a really wild, like unrestricted, free period of my life. My parents didn't know what was going on. They got home late, and we made sure to get in like right before they got home. They had no clue what we were up to. And this was the first time that we had like MTV, because we didn't have that in England. So we just saw like all of this like new stuff on TV. Like I was 9, 10, like learning about like sex, drugs, and all of this stuff. Like,
and rock and roll.
yeah, it was such a shock to me. And the American kids that I made friends with, like, they would just seem so much more mature because they knew about certain things. And it was wild. It was fun. But then that was also the time period when I realized that being Black in the US was going to be different than being Black in England, where I think they make more of an effort to kind of be inclusive. Because I remember the holidays we celebrated like Diwali, the Festival of Lights. We celebrated Eid, and they made an attempt. In Tennessee, it was like, what is that? And, just the way I talked at the time, I had an English accent. They thought that I was like trying to be fancy. And so just learning how to talk like them or like somebody else was very stressful. And that's, I think that is when I started to really have like an identity crisis where I'm like actively trying to change myself. Because in England, it's like sometimes felt like an outsider, this and that, but I was too young and it wasn't a situation where I felt pressure, like, okay, you have to. I mean, except for learning the language, I didn't feel like I had to really change myself. In Tennessee, I was just like, okay, this is not going to work for you. And you need to figure out how you're going to become somebody who can blend in a little more, because I really did stick out like a sore thumb.
We had a couple of comments talk about different cultures, England versus Nashville, but they both have royalty. That's true. And the fact that there's a different level of disrespect. And yeah.
Yeah. My family and I, so when I started this book, I sat us down and I conducted really extensive interviews with them. one of the questions I asked was like the differences in racism in England and Nashville.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, so my father said that he just felt like in England, there was like a ceiling, and as a Black person, they'll be nice to you, but you're just never going to get above that level.
Right. Right.
My brother said that in the US, it's kind of like he all of a sudden felt like a threat. He was kind of
Mm.
like, he's like, he misbehaves. In England, he was kind of treated just like a misbehaving boy, you know?
Right.
In Nashville, it was like, okay, this is a problem. He's a problem. And like the measures they took against him uh, didn't really make sense. It like exacerbating the issue, like because he loved to draw, and instead of like encouraging him to draw, and like when he played like pranks, you know, redirecting his energy, it was just like detention, suspension.
Hmm.
And so he was, you know, almost criminalized from a pretty young age. Um, and so it's definitely different, very different forms of the same thing that I
Hmm.
noticed in different countries.
Hmm. And it's interesting that you say that because yes, he faced that as an immigrant or someone new to the country, but then after being here for a while, that's what
Mhm.
happens, with Black Americans. So
Right.
yes, so he was immediately put into that same category instead of it being, okay, maybe he needs, more work to do, or maybe he's not being challenged, or, these
Right.
other things. You
Right.
immediately want to label him negatively. So that's just very interesting to hear that. And I'm not surprised though, as a Black American, I'm not surprised, in that regard. But also just coming here, and then you at that age also figuring out who you are, because one of the things, yes, it's a story about your family and all the different you know branches and links within the family, but it really is your coming of age story as well. That's how I read it.
Hmm.
Just you growing and learning who you wanted to be and becoming who you wanted to be.
Yeah, I think so. And it's like there's so many different aspects that I had to grapple with, not just like racial things. I remember, I'm not sure if I should say this. I'm not sure how to say this like sensitively, but I remember when I first moved to the US, I was mostly hanging out with white children. They looked like the children that I was with in England. And, um, you know, I felt like they were a lot um, less, I guess, aggressive
Mm.
in terms of trying to figure out who I was. Like they didn't really
Mhm.
have a lot of interest in my culture. Um, the Black Americans, they were aggressive in terms of their like questioning. Like they were
Mhm.
really intent on finding out like where are you from, what's Africa like, this, and this. And I was just so like kind of overwhelmed by it. I avoided that. And then later on in my life, now I have, you know, so many close Black women friends. And I'm just like, I don't know where I'd be or who I would be if I hadn't made that move from, okay, let me just hang out with like the meek, kind of like studious, nerdy, like white kids, and then really reaching across the diaspora to make friends. Like my closest friends, I have Black American friends, I have Jamaican friends,
Mhm.
and I have African friends, immigrant friends. And just kind of finding myself involved racially, deciding that I needed to find like who my people were. And
Mhm.
I couldn't find my people if I didn't know who I was myself.
Right. Right.
And yeah, I was a I was kind of a mess for a lot of my adolescence and my early adulthood until I figured out these identity crises that I had. And even I had so many negative opinions and stereotypes about Black Americans because of what I was told in my community. I was told not to hang out with Black Americans because I was told that they don't value education as much. It's ridiculous. I mean, every culture, every people values education, what's the best for their children. So I had to unlearn those things and just figure out just how insidious they are and how wrong and how unfair, how divisive. And then another aspect was the religious thing. Figuring that out was like still a lifelong struggle that I'm definitely not anywhere near the end of. Probably somewhere still towards the beginning and still trying to figure out my beliefs. And that was just such a traumatic experience, I think. The church and the religious environment I grew up in, anytime I had a problem, I'd just be told, just pray about it. Emotional problem, anything, just pray about it. And if you believe, then God will help you, he'll fix it. If he didn't fix it, I blamed myself. I didn't believe, my belief wasn't strong enough. And then when I finally started moving away from that religion, I just felt completely lost. Added to that, you know, the threat of hell when I was growing up was very real and like very, very literal in my community. And so that was always hanging over my head. And I grew up as a child who was like terrified of God and like terrified of hell and just really tormented by sin and like shame over everything. I mean, even though we were bad kids in certain aspects, like I always felt that there was something like broken in me because I didn't seem to have the faith and the like religious conviction that other people in my family had. So I just felt like I was the biggest sinner. I'm hellbound. So that was a lot to get over. And I still have not completely healed from that. You know, I still obsess over like, am I going to go to hell for this? Am I going to go to hell for that? Lots of shame about a lot of things. So figuring that out, it's something I'm still working on.
And it definitely, thank you for sharing that. You know, that's powerful. And once again, as I said earlier, just telling your story and being honest and being, you know, forthright about your feelings, that's powerful because you're not the only one. There are a lot of people who struggle in those ways because there are messages. I remember my father passed away a few years ago, but one of the things he used to always say, I can't stand it. We go somewhere and everybody's always preaching hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. Because he, as a young man in Southern Ohio, had a similar experience of somebody, you know, saying something to him across the pulpit once and, you know, how it affected him. So, yes, it may have been in your upbringing specifically where you're from, but you're definitely not the only one who's ever experienced that or, you know, who is still working out their faith journey and all of that. So that's important that you do that. And sharing in the book, you know, we kind of see some of the things that you learned and how you're working through that. Also, as some others in your family work through that as well. You know, one of the other things I wanted to bring up that you mentioned was talking about kind of finding your own tribe. Yes, you have these tribes that you come from, these people that you come from, but being able to find your own tribe, but finding yourself first. That is, when you said that, I'm like, yeah, I just didn't want to interrupt you. Because that is such a thing, you know, as I mentioned to you earlier, for different reasons. I'm a person who moved a lot. You know, I have moved a lot. You know, recently I went to a family wedding and I was telling my aunt how many places I've lived. She's like, oh my God, I've lived so many different places because for so long I was looking for that sense of place, for that sense of home, for that sense of finding my tribe, finding my people. And it's something that I think a lot of people may struggle with or be challenged with, whether, you know, it's an immigrant situation or just, you know, their own personal thing. But being able to find yourself in order to find your people, that's so powerful.
Yeah. And I still like wouldn't say that I've necessarily found myself 100%. Yeah. Yeah, because the spiritual aspect is something that, I would like to find kind of something maybe to believe in or hold on to, sense of like just comfort or connection to something larger. Um, it's not like I go through life feeling that there's an emptiness or something missing necessarily. I just kind of envy people who have a spirituality that's like rich and positive. Like I didn't know that you could have a relationship with the divine that was not based on like fear and shame. And that's something that seems really beautiful that some people have that, I would one day like to find. I'm not like actively looking for like next religion or anything like that. But it is something I feel that is a positive in a lot of people's lives, and I would say I'm open to it and just very skeptical and dealing with a lot of pain. But I don't want to completely close myself off and be cynical and just not receptive to anything else.
Mm-hmm. And you'll find it. Just the mere fact that you're open to it, it will come. It will come.
Yeah.
And it is a lifelong journey, spirituality and just so many different, phases of life. It's a lifelong journey. And sometimes it shifts, it ebbs and flows, just depending on where you are or what's happening in your life. But the fact that you want it, you'll find it.
Yeah.
I'll say that. Tell us what the meaning of a coastline is an immeasurable thing means.
Okay, so the title of this memoir, it refers to something called the coastline paradox, which is that if you are trying to measure the coastline or border of a country, it just depends how far you zoom into the twists and turns. So if you take like a country that's shaped like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you measure the coastline,
Move it over a little bit. Can't see
can
it.
you see?
Okay. Now I can.
Okay. And you measure the coastline here, 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 here.
Mm-hmm.
At like a certain distance. But then if you zoom in and you take into account all these different turns, it just gets larger and larger and larger and larger. So a lot of countries have like competitions where they try to boast like we have, this many miles of coastline. But a lot of times they're kind of cheating. So I liked that title. It was actually a line in a poem that I'd written because it's about the fact that it's so difficult to measure certain things that you might think are simple. Just measuring like a border of a place or the boundaries of a physical location. Once you think about it or once you zoom in different angles, it's completely different and it's almost infinite. So it reminded me of how this book started. It was supposed to be something simple, just tracing a history of one place. And then it just kind of expanded and went in all different twists and turns. But I also can't take credit for the title of this book because it was a line in a poem I'd written and then it was a line in the memoir. But I had a different original title. And then my editor suggested this one instead.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back and forth and I settled on this and I'm very glad I did.
Yes, because it jumps out at you.
Yeah.
When you see that, like, what's that all about? A coastline is an immeasurable thing. And then look at the beautiful cover.
I think it's the right title and the right cover.
Mm-hmm. I
That
love
also
the
took
cover.
me a really long time to find this cover.
Mm-hmm. So were you worked with someone to do that for you, or was it a piece of artwork that was already created, or?
Yeah, it's a painting
Okay.
by a Nigerian artist, Adekunle. And so my publishing company sent me lots and lots of different covers.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like any of them. And, I was worried about being a pain. Like, I didn't want to be that person who just, like, doesn't like, I just really didn't like a lot of them.
Right.
And so finally I saw this one, and I was like, okay. I looked up some of his other paintings, and there were a lot that I was really drawn to and I think would have worked. But I was definitely most impressed by this one because I just love the
Mhm.
colors and I love the patterns and how it warps. I
Mhm.
think it fits the title and the book perfectly.
It definitely does. As soon as I saw it, I was like, "Ooh, I love it!" Because we didn't get into it tonight, but there's a part of the book where you talk a lot about the different things with like African fabrics and things like that. I really love the textiles and
Yeah.
things of Africa. A few years ago, I went to an exhibit where and I bought the book as well that talks about the history of the fabrics and all of that. The wax
Hmm.
prints and all of the ways that the different prints came into being and what they mean. So, for those of you who are interested in that sort of stuff, I definitely suggest you pick up the book because you're going to learn about Mary's story, but you also learn a lot about that culture and the importance of that. Laura had a comment about the title. We talked about like the borders of your heart and soul are immeasurable.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah. It's definitely about a lot of memoirs kind of end, I think, in a very neat place where it's kind of wrapped up on a hopeful note. And I like to think my memoir is more like the ending is like a starting point.
Mhm.
And there's still so many other things I have to figure out in terms of like the boundaries of country, personal identity, race, selfhood, womanhood. And that'll come in, later books. So thank you for
Right.
that comment.
Which is a good segue to another question. Has writing this book and digging into all these aspects of family culture given you any ideas for stories to tell in a future book?
Yes, actually, I'm trying to figure that out now, and I'm just super, super stressed out about
Mm.
that because I either want to write a novel, but I'm so terrified of writing a novel for some reason. Um, so in the fourth chapter, I talk about my great great grandfather and the legend of him being kidnapped as a slave, going up the trans-Saharan slave trade. They thought he had leprosy. They let him go. He walked back home. This is a family legend. And I'm just like, it doesn't sound very plausible. Like, how do you walk back from like Libya to Nigeria? And then my father was like, no, no, no. He didn't go all the way up to Libya. It was like just a little bit around Lake Chad. And I'm just like, it still seems just, he swears it's true. He's just like,
Mhm.
yes, this happened. So I don't know if it happened or not. But so I was gonna maybe do a novel about what he might have experienced on this journey, which sounds incredible.
Mhm.
Um, that the idea of doing that kind of terrifies me, though. The other book I had an idea about writing was just a book of essays. So I travel a lot. I'm still a
Mhm.
nomad. I've been to like something like 60 countries,
Oh
and
wow.
I travel solo a lot. I've
Ooh, I
had a lot.
love it.
I've had a lot of very strange experiences as a solo Black woman in some
Mhm.
places where they really have not seen a lot of Black people before, or any. I've been told had some very wild experiences. So I was thinking about maybe writing something about my travels. So I'm not sure yet, but I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, you'll figure it out. It'll come together. But one thing I love the fact that you mentioned travel and solo travel. And yes, I know sometimes you can have interesting experiences. I have when I've done it, but I'm always recommending to friends, whether it's something, here in the US or wherever it is, to do a trip by yourself because there's just so much power in being able to go somewhere and set your own schedule and
Mhm.
what you want to do when you want to do it.
Yeah,
All of that.
I notice a lot of people, women especially, they are afraid of doing certain things alone. Not
Mm.
just the danger aspect, like, yes, it can be dangerous to travel to a place you don't speak the language and you're alone. But just in terms of like social conventions, like a lot of women are afraid to be seen like eating alone or
Mhm.
going to the movies alone because they think that people are judging them or saying like, why is she alone? That's one thing that I love to do, and I learned to get over it. Like, why would you hold yourself back because of, the way that you might be judged for being solo. And I also really think it's important to travel solo as a woman because you kind of learn to trust your instincts more. You're the only one who you can count on, who is keeping you alive. You learn to ignore the doubts in your mind that you sometimes have, and you trust yourself more. So definitely travel solo.
Yes. That was a bonus. I wasn't expecting that, but I love it because I am a proponent of it. I do it as much as possible. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention before I let you go. You do have a book of poetry coming out next year, Mass for Shut-ins. It'll be out in March.
Yes.
So just give us a little bit of what we can look forward to with that.
Okay, so Mass for Shut-ins is my first book of poetry. It will be out from Yale University Press on March 21st, 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And my poetry is very, very different than this memoir. So it's not very narrative. It's not autobiographical. It's very dark, I would say. The one thing it has in common is it's influenced by different religious traditions, like Islam, Christianity, indigenous religions. So there's that interplay of spirituality, but it's definitely not a coming of age or like a feel good, hopeful book of poetry. Like in Black poetry recently, there's been a lot of emphasis on like Black joy, and this book is not.
Okay.
Would not be considered a joyful book, but it's pulled from some very dark places in my heart that were formed from the religious environment I grew up in. It's concerned with hell, damnation, human nature, the worst aspects of people in our souls, and it's a very heavy, I think, intense, kind of chaotic book. I mean, but I hope people will like it.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes we need that, we need that just to read it and to, share with you your thoughts and, delve into our own thoughts as well, based upon the things that we read. So I'll definitely be on the lookout for it. And, congratulations, because that is it won the 2022 Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize. So it's an award-winning book of poetry, not just a book of poetry, but an award-winning one. So thank you so much for your time, Mary. I appreciate you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Our time is up, believe it or not. Seemed like it went by kind of quickly.
Thank you so much for these questions.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so glad that I had an opportunity to talk to you, and hopefully it will not be the last time, as you have other works coming out as well. So I wish you a good evening. I just want to make a couple of quick announcements to the folks here, but I will be in touch with you soon, and please take care.
All right. Thank you, Marcy.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed reading Mary's book, as well as just talking to her and learning some things about her story, her process, and all of that. And I really do suggest that, especially if you just want to know about the experience of a person who has lived in multiple places, that is an immigrant to our country and things of that nature, or if you just want to learn a lot about Nigeria, I definitely suggest that you pick up a copy of this book. So by means of announcement, next week we will have actually technically our last book of the year, which is going to be Weightless with Yvette Dion. So she will be here. It is also a memoir of sorts. So be on the lookout for this next week. Yvette Dion will be here to talk about Weightless, which the tagline is making space for my resilient body and soul. So we'll be talking to her next week. And then in 2 weeks, I'm going to do something special and close out the year with BGC Book Club's Lit year in review. So be on the lookout on, Facebook and other spaces for a little survey, because I need you guys' help with this. But basically, in 2 weeks, I want to come on and kind of recap some of the, best books of the year, recap some of the other literary moments of the year, and even some of the things that we've done here through the BGC Book Club. So I really appreciate your time and your energy being here. Please tell a friend. If you're not subscribed on YouTube, please go and subscribe so you can keep up with everything that we've got going on in this particular platform, as well as other programs that will be forthcoming. So thanks again. Yes, it is year end already, Laura, believe it or not. But I'm already getting ready for next year. I've already got people lined up for next year. So this is going to continue. We will go forward. And I appreciate all of you all for being here in this space once again, and look forward to talking to you again real soon. Take care. See you next week. Bye-bye.